So in 1985, a New York Times CBS News poll asked 1,500 Americans to name a famous Japanese person. The answer? Hirohito, Bruce Lee, and Godzilla. And so the funny thing is, I think, is that, this monster has such a cultural icon that, people pretty much associated, just as much with Japan as, a non-Japanese person and the emperor or something like that. And this was, 85, which, like by that point, I think what's interesting is Japan, like kind of has gone from being a land of cheap knockoffs and stuff like that to where their exports start becoming a market quality, and that's partially due to like the whole Deming thing, which maybe we'll touch upon that. But anyways, this week we'll talk about the 1954 original Godzilla, the Americanized remake in '56, and the '98, which kind of launched a little bit of the rebirth of the interest of Godzilla in America. So once again, I'm John Chang with Dan Edmonds.
Hi there.
And I think we talked a little bit about this, about the idea, like, what is it about like these kind of monster movies that we love them so much? I mean, it's just one of those things I think that continues to fascinate us.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's, you just have to look at any sort of young boy who's under the age of 6 and, you give them a dinosaur or something like this. And it's this sort of appeal of something that is massive and monstrous and can destroy lots of things about society. And has all this sort of power at its disposal, but is also just completely out of control. There's something sort of quite sort of interesting about that. It's one of the, like, go back to the sort of Susan Sontag article, this idea of watching the world burn is quite satisfying in a sci-fi or a horror movie a lot of the time.
Yeah, I kind of took that quote about the poll from this book, Godzilla in My Mind, by this gentleman named William Tsutsui, who's kind of more of an academic, but than like a film critic and stuff like that. He talked about as a kid, like dressing up as Godzilla, and then like people not recognizing him and stuff like that. But at the same time, though, yeah, it was this kind of, like you said, this just vicariously, imagining that you're like, stomping on a city. Not necessarily Tokyo and stuff like that, and we'll definitely talk a little bit about kind of the significance of that. And here in the original '54 version, I mean, it's an interesting aspect because this was made less than 10 years from the Hiroshima and Nagasaki destruction, so it's to put it into context, that was kind of the Japanese 9/11 right and stuff, but it was one that like ended the war versus like, of course, like launching a war against the Taliban that we had, stuff like that. And also we're now the Cold War is on and everything, so there's just these different things of kind of really making nuclear war a huge concern.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of felt this. If you watch what happened in the American movie industry after 9/11, there were a lot of disaster movies that came out after that were used, I think, as a way of kind of expressing some of this kind of shock and sort of trauma of the events. And I you feel that Godzilla has the same effect for maybe Japanese people in the 50s, basically. And it's a very on the nose kind of metaphor. It's pretty obvious from the get-go. You have ships that are, there's a huge explosion underwater and the ships catch fire and sink. And so already with bright lights and lots of wind, and you think, okay, this is pretty obvious what this is referring to.
And the other thing I think was interesting is, the director, had fought in World War I in China, and upon returning back to Japan, there was this kind of thing that the soldiers made, the Americans made the Japanese soldiers do, which was like, like land up in Hiroshima and have them see like kind of, how thoroughly defeated Japan was, everything. And he said that really made a huge impact on him.
Yeah, I bet. Wow, that's something else. Okay, interesting.
Yeah,
I mean, it's a very interesting sort of way in which they frame the creature or the horror of this, because when you first arrive on this island, the old people, and this is probably the most interesting thing for me about the movie, was that the old people describe it as an ancient relic of the past that's been woken up and has been disturbed by nuclear testing or nuclear weapons or something like this. And I sort of started thinking, why would it what makes it something that's ancient, or how did that sort of come into their mind as they were sort of conceptualizing this? And for me, it's kind of, whilst we have nuclear weapons as a technology that very few people kind of understand, and the scale of it is so beyond our normal comprehension, it seems like a force of nature, something that is almost completely uncontrollable. Right. And that sort of, I guess, when you think about sort of like dinosaurs or the ancient world, that's equally something that is beyond our comprehension, because it's so long ago that we don't really understand that either. So it's kind of mixing the limits of what we can deal with as a sort of human society. I think they were trying to do with something like that. And there's also the interest, and there's one, sure. they also say, oh yeah, we used to sacrifice girls to keep Godzilla at bay, which comes into play later on, but yeah.
And so the opening scene too, with that boat and the Japanese fishing boat straying, there was actually in March of the same year an actual Japanese fishing boat that strayed into the U.S. Testing of the hydrogen bomb in the Bikini Atoll. So so it's just they were using like a very a current event and stuff like that. And what's interesting is the American version kind of has that, but they kind of really downplayed the idea of you see the destruction and stuff like that, but really it's different in how they kind of show it. Like, in fact, the emphasis is more on they quickly as quickly as possible get to Godzilla stomping around and stuff like that. Like,
But I have to say, I mean, I was quite surprised at how subtle and well stylized this movie was, the cinematography and effects and things, compared to what I imagined. I imagined it was, first of all, I didn't know it was going to be black and white. I imagined it would be in color, and there'd just be a guy stomping around, a model city in a rubber suit. But the way it's actually shot, he only attacks at night, and they go to the lengths of kind of slowing down his movements. So it's actually pretty effective. It's only really towards the end where it starts to look a little bit like, oh, it's clearly a guy in a rubber suit. But, a lot of the effects, considering this is 1954, are actually pretty good, and it's very atmospheric, very dark and somber, much more somber than, you would expect of a Godzilla movie. Everyone, all the actors and the people in it are clearly very traumatized by what's going on. And the whole tone of it is very, very sort of threatening in a way, I'd say.
It kind of reminded me of Jaws in that, they really don't reveal Godzilla until like later in the movie and stuff.
Yeah.
And I agree. That's pretty effective to kind of do that. I mean, and ironically, of course, with Spielberg, it was more the fact that like they couldn't get Bruce the Shark to work and stuff, and that's why they kept kind of delaying the showing it. But then ultimately, that was what really made it more effective and stuff. Was kind of again the same idea of like delaying, kind of showing Jaws and stuff.
Yeah. And I mean, there's the first attack from Godzilla where he's actually in the city, and you see, they really try and recreate this idea of an entire city burning, which is exactly what would have happened from the nuclear bombs. And it's very effectively done, actually. It's considering it's in black and white, and it's a long time ago that they've, it's really done in quite a sort of tasteful and subtle way, really, if there is such a way of describing that. But, I was surprised at how good it was. And also the music is so iconic. I'd forgotten how iconic that was. It's it has almost like a sort of, it's not out of place with Seven Samurai and things like this. You can kind of see why people got really into it. Speaking of which, it has Takashi Shimura from Seven Samurai in it.
Indeed. And I think also with the what's called the monster itself, we really see like when you say stomping around, I mean, it reminds me of this game that from the 80s called Rampage. And
Rampage a lot. Yeah,
you can actually be a monster and you're stomp around, kind of chase down people, that kind of thing and stuff like that. I think what's also interesting is that here like people like turn to the scientists for answers, which is kind of like a nerd's fantasy, right? And stuff. And I feel like that's kind of one of the reasons why, like, the nerdist folks kind of really love, Godzilla as a, like one of those things that like probably like always at the top of the list of favorite, movies and stuff like that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I thought that was kind of interesting as well, in that, there's a lot of, first of all, it sets the stage of, if you interfere with nature and you develop sort of weapons of mass destruction, they can come back and have unforeseen effects, is basically what Godzilla is. But then the solution is then this other kind of splitting of air atoms or water atoms, so that all the oxygen goes out, the oxygen destroyer, which I thought was interesting, in the idea that you could counteract splitting, almost like an expression of the fallout of a nuclear bomb with some other kind of splitting of an atom. And it sort of magically strips fish of flesh, which was kind of strange, but that was kind of an interesting idea. Also, the first time I've seen, I don't know how many evil scientists had eye patches in 1954, but I think that must have been pretty much one of the first. I don't think, had we had Dr. No yet? Because that's the only, he didn't have an eye patch, so yeah, it's definitely one of the first eye patched villains.
And also, what do you think of the love triangle that kind of between that scientist and then the daughter of the Takashi Shimura what's it called, character and stuff, and the young guy.
Honestly, I was mostly oblivious to it, because I was more just paying attention to the effects of Godzilla, or how they were going to explain it and things. But yeah, it was it was there. I can't say I really got hugely invested in it, but yeah,
it was just kind of, I thought a funny thing that it was maybe just something that they kind of felt needed to make it more of a human story, I guess, and stuff, and because otherwise it's just this monster stomping around and stuff, right? So they had to kind of have some kind of human drama going on and stuff to kind of ground things out.
But speaking of which, I mean, the thing that surprised me was the after effects of his attack being sort of much more seriously dealt with than I expected. They have in the hospital, you had them sort of scanning radiated kids, and I think there was a girl who was blind and things like this. It was pretty dark, really, not what I really expected at all. But obviously, this is what happened. And everywhere he goes, he leaves this trail of radioactivity and destroys sort of land as he goes as well, which was kind of interesting. And I mean, it represents this kind of, for me, it sort of represents this unstoppable force that was obviously very relevant to what really happened. There's something that you just can't control or stop, really.
Well, you and I, talked offline about, how, there's this reference of that for the Japanese, the Godzilla is basically this metaphor for nuclear, atomic destruction stuff. And, even kind of ironically, I really didn't know that the skin on him has a rough texture because it's supposed to represent the burn marks, right, from a nuclear blast and stuff.
Right,
and it's something that I had never even thought about.
No, me neither.
Yeah, and I think what's also kind of an interesting connection too is that in the Eastern culture, this kind of dragon, right, and stuff is this kind of this idea of a benevolence, or but it can be destructive and stuff like that, it's this kind of power and stuff, and versus in the West, right, the dragons, St. George and so on, there's always this kind of monster that needs to be destroyed. And then so definitely we see how like you talked about the worshiping with the villagers and stuff is in the Japanese version, and it's kind of downplayed in the American wise and stuff.
Not that St. George is aimed at anti-Asian sentiment or something like that. Who knows? It may well be, but yeah, no, that's interesting. I hadn't thought of it in terms of Godzilla as this kind of the emblem of power, and as the dragon. I guess it's kind of again, you mess with the forces of nature, or this this emblem of power, and it turns on you and literally breathes fire. And burns you and stuff like this. So.
Well, it definitely, like Godzilla embodies, the things that are like kind of, the primal natural fears for the Japanese, right? Because, here's a country that has to deal with earthquake, thunder, fire, like kind of, like you have the annual tsunamis and stuff like that. Same way we have the hurricanes in the East Coast in the U.S. Like the kind of the force of like kind of, where the power is like kind of both life and destruction stuff too is like, the what they call the kind of like we have heard of like kind of kamikaze as like the pilots that kind of suicide into the U.S. carriers and stuff like that, but really they're also kind of is this myth of these divine winds, because what happened was that the tsunamis, just whatever kind of timing stuff like that, when the Mongols tried, like a couple times to invade Japan and stuff like that, they would of course have to come across China on ships and everything, and each time, these divine winds, which was the tsunami and stuff like that, would wipe out the Mongol fleet and stuff. I mean, it happened like more than once. So basically, it's one of the few reasons why, like, Japan like remained so insular, despite the fact that, like, a lot of the Asia was conquered by the Mongols and stuff.
It's very interesting. Yeah, I didn't realize that. Yeah, so I mean, I guess that's kind of maybe where the slightly, in the sequels, Godzilla has a more benevolent kind of side and actually fights off other monsters, which I guess we'll get into in the rest of our Godzilla month. Yeah, no, I thought the ending as well is this kind of interesting, because we have this scientist who's created this new dangerous weapon who ends up basically committing suicide by cutting the rope and burying, making sure he can't reinvent this weapon ever again. So it's a kind of almost like a underwater Harry Kiri in the end, to ensure that he can't sort of ever unleash this again. But again, it sort of harked back to the Islanders at the beginning, saying, you need to sacrifice something to this kind of to this force in order to abate it, which made me sort of think it's kind of and on a broader scale, this is a technological advance that they are sacrificing in the name of staving off something worse. So it makes you wonder if like this is sort of maybe a representation of all the technological progress that got made during World War II, and how that had to be kind of maybe stepped back a little bit following the defeat in the war, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, overall, even like kind of the classic hero's journey really talks about the idea of some kind of sacrifice, like kind of that is part of the process and stuff like that. And so I guess in a way, I mean, it's in this case, it's an actual sacrifice. I mean, sometimes it could be simply be a setback or something that, kind of, what's it called, is, like maybe just suffering, whatever, something like that. But in this case, I mean, he just basically took himself out. And again, there's kind of like almost a neat and tidy solution to the love triangle, when the third party basically, opts out, I guess, and stuff.
Yeah. An easy way of settling that one in the script, isn't it? So
speaking of like kind of settling the scripts and all that, I guess we'll just kind of briefly mention how in the 56 version, the Americans wanted to kind of import, like kind of the Godzilla movies, stuff like that. So it's funny how we haven't really come across this with a remake, yet, where basically, the US version just took the movie and then they would kind of dub voices, and then also have like shots with body doubles, and just have the backs of the characters to basically, have the emphasis on Raymond Burr playing this reporter called Steve Martin, ironically. And all of it was shot in one day with him, because apparently, for one day of work, he was paid $10,000, which really, equals about $97,000 today's, dollars. Not too bad, not too shabby for one day's work,
It's pretty good. And probably without all the inconvenience of shots of children with radioactive sickness and things like that, that sort of thing removed for audiences in the US. So yeah, it was, I mean, I didn't actually see it. I know you did, John, but
well, there wasn't much that you missed.
Right, yeah.
It's kind of like some of the other remakes we've done where, you could just easily, kind of not watch it and, not felt like you kind of missed out on much.
I mean, I guess the difference with this one is this is almost like a kind of a US edited version, really,
it is, yeah.
Rather than the only other thing I can think of that's similar would be, and this is just a totally random kind of side track, but Battle of the Planets and G-Force, which was a cartoon show back in the 80s, where the Japanese original version had quite a lot more violence and there was much more sort of tension between the main characters, whereas in the US one, in Battle of the Planets, they kind of inserted kind of a C-3PO and R2-D2 character just to kind of splice together scenes that didn't make sense. So it's kind of like, they just the two, Mark and Jason, would be about to go and sort of beat each other up. And then all of a sudden it would just sort of cut to these two and go, oh, and then they went to the island with the mysterious robots, and then it would just cut straight back to the next scene. So yeah, I guess it's kind of one of those things. That's what they used to do, is just sort of edit out the stuff that didn't really float with US audiences back then.
And another thing that you can another way you can tell, is like the parts with the actual characters speaking English, the Japanese characters and stuff, their English was a little too perfect. That's another way you could tell that it was not filmed in Japan and stuff.
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah, I mean, is it a similar running time, or did they cut it down quite a lot for the?
About a good half hour. Which the parts that kind of they more or less cut out, as we kind of talked about with the whitewash article and stuff. They just basically made it where like there's minimal talk about the nuclear kind of implications and because again, like it will kind of once we talk about the 98 version, it's interesting how the US versions just have no reference to any like kind of the US Americans using like nuclear bombs or testing or anything like that.
Yeah. I mean, there's a little bit in the 98 version, which I guess is as good a time as any to move on to the 98 version. But I mean, they kind of, then they sort of allude to it in the beginning that, that what's caused this fishing ship is, some sort of radioactive mutation that's happened over time. And he starts off, Matthew Broderick starts off in Chernobyl, and then they call him out to, the sea around Japan. So,
but notice it's Chernobyl is like kind of course the Russian.
Kind of that's just a nuclear accident, not an actual attack from America. Yeah.
Well, by the Russians, kind of their goof off and stuff like that. And in this case, the testing, that kind of creating the problem with Godzilla is from the French, right, and stuff.
Oh, I missed that.
Yeah. Which is why funny. Kind of Jean Reno is brought in and stuff like that.
Wow. Yeah, I totally missed all of that. I just thought it was, just vaguely. I just thought, oh, they like Jean Reno or something. But that's a real diversion.
So it's interesting how it's kind of just totally like there's Americans never do any testing there in the Pacific.
Wow.
I thought it's funny too that like they kept showing like kind of these different iguanas on the island and stuff like that, and here they remodeled Godzilla from this kind of the what we kind of used to of a monster that kind of stands upright like a T-Rex or something like that, to like he's doing a lot more crawling, just kind of like a giant iguana, really.
Yeah. I mean, obviously this was made after Jurassic Park, and it kind of rips off large parts of that movie and redoes it. I mean, the difference between this one and the original is that in this one Godzilla has babies, but because it's a mutant, it can just sort of asexually reproduce, and they tell you that lots and lots of times all the way through the movie, because it seems so inconceivable. And and for some reason Godzilla has chosen a large metropolis to nest in, because why not, and so this, of course, gives them the excuse to do a scene with lots of small Godzilla's running around, although they don't refer to them as Godzukis, which I thought was a bit of a missed opportunity there. But it's like the usual thing with the raptors in Jurassic Park. They're chasing them around little dark corridors. It's kind of like a bit more of a horror movie vibe than a stomping over cities. Definitely. Which, of course, is what makes the first one, I guess, to a Japanese audience that much, so horrible, is the fact that it really does represent what really happened in the cities, which is where the horror and this kind of shocking element comes from. This one, they've tried to kind of obviously, put it into basically just rehash Jurassic Park. So, yeah.
Yeah, it is interesting how, you what's called, it's hard to not, kind of just make that connection and stuff like that. And then the other thing I thought was interesting too is like kind of it seemed like they really like to drill home this idea that people were doing the more damage than the monster. Like, because different times the military were firing things and they're blowing up buildings left and right and stuff. And then other times, like kind of even like kind of course the basic idea of how Godzilla was made and stuff like that is the the testing that was done and how that kind of created this monster and everything. So what, overall, it's like kind of this basic thing of like that we apparently are doing this to ourselves and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, like the 90% of most sci-fi movie trope, which is, nature will mess you up more than you can possibly mess nature up, is essentially it in a nutshell. Yeah, I mean, the effects I thought were pretty decent, really, for 1998, actually. I think they spent a ton of money on the effects on this.
Yeah.
I mean, they're pretty reasonable for the time, I would say.
And the director, Roland Emmerich, I mean, he had still yet to like kind of, make his. Well, actually, I guess he had already made the Independence Day, which that was that big alien invasion blockbuster that like kind of, I think like kind of overall he kind of became the mega disaster kind of guy, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And this was I remember this being quite a high profile release at the time. You had sort of Puff Daddy and Jamiroquai doing tracks for the soundtrack, if I remember correctly. And
but it got pretty like razzed, like something we talk about often and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a great movie. Yeah, you got Matthew Broderick running around trying to sort of say, hey, everybody, no, it's just protecting its young. And that gets old pretty quickly. And there isn't really much else to it. There's kind of a really dysfunctional relationship with this, with his girlfriend, who seems to just sort of like, just roll him under the bus at any given opportunity all the way through the movie. And he still kind of like has something for her even after all that. But
it didn't really do her career much service.
It didn't. I didn't really find anything else that she'd been in. So.
No.
And it's
got
most of
television. That's about it.
It seems to have all the rest of the cast of The Simpsons in it as well, because you've got Hank Azaria and Harry shit, and I can't remember his name now, but yeah, Harry Shearer. There we go. Yeah.
Oh right. Yeah, I think the only kind of other notable thing was Jean Reno kind of turning up again and stuff. And I kind of it's a slightly better role than the Rollerball, but not much of a stretch though.
No, it's not. I would say of sort of random Jean Reno French character cameos in Hollywood pictures. This is it's definitely better than Pink Panther. And
oh yes, forgot about that.
Definitely better than Rollerball, but probably below others, I would say. It's and there's just lots of trying to make we're in post Pulp Fiction world here, so there's lots of sort of trying to be kind of ad hoc, casual conversation about different things. It's always about French coffee or French this and French that. And it's like, all right, we get it. They're French. Okay. So, yeah, that gets annoying. But, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I still like one of my favorite movies with him is Leon the Professional, and like after that I just feel like he just hasn't gotten many good roles like that they really kind of use his talents and stuff like that. So hopefully we'll see him again in something better at some point.
Yeah. He must have had some good roles, but I'm sure he made lots of money, so good for him. He's in lots of really pretty big budget productions, so I'm sure he made a good pay packet off all of those. So
yeah,
fair play, Jean.
Definitely, it kind of reminds me of, I think we talked about that with the Dirty Rotten Scoundrels, where Michael Caine talked about, like one of the movies, like, kind of, really being bad that he had. Oh, it was the Jaws 3D that he, like, just talked about not even never watching himself, but hey, you paid for this house, like that kind of deal.
Exactly, yeah. Could be worse things. I think it reminds me of that quote in I can't remember what it is now. I think it was like one of the Clerks movies that maybe Dogma or I can't remember. No, it was like the Clerks remake or something where it had Matt Damon and Ben Affleck sort of like saying, "Hey, remember you've got to follow the formula. You do one critical success and then you do a big budget one, and you keep alternating so people think you've got some credibility."
Right.
So yeah. So I guess this was the first of, unless you've got anything else to say about the Godzilla 1998 movie. I'm struggling, to be honest with you, but
no problem.
It wasn't the worst remake we've seen by a long shot. It was okay. It was quite of reasonable kind of eye candy, but nothing earth shattering by any stretch.
Yeah, I mean, it's just one of those things that, like, it's interesting. On the one hand, there's a lot of hype to it, stuff like that, and yet, like, kind of, it was like kind of ultimately a even though that, like, it did have a profit, it was still, like, kind of considered a disappointment by a lot of people, stuff like that. I think mostly because, like, everyone kind of believed that there would be kind of this revival of interest in Godzilla, and there was actually even a sequel. There was a Godzilla 2 and stuff like that, but really, like, there wasn't much, like, kind of, I mean, it didn't really do much for the franchise and stuff like that overall.
Yeah. So I guess coming next in our month of Godzilla, we're doing the more recent remakes of the 2014 US remake and the 2016 Japanese remake, Shin Godzilla.
Right.
And throwing in Godzilla 2000 as well.
Yeah, and I think like that one was of course the last one was the Japanese kind of reviving some interest after ironically that's one thing the 98 version did achieve, was kind of revive a little bit of interest in Godzilla and stuff like that. And we'll definitely talk about the 2014 because that of course will lead to what's become part of the legendary franchise of the monster series. And of course, like ultimately we'll get to the Godzilla versus Kong. That's like kind of the big thing that's coming up in the next few couple weeks and stuff like that. So
I like your optimism about this franchise. I don't know if I'd quite go as far as to call it legendary just yet. I think let's give it another 20 years.
Well, Legendary Pictures is
right. Okay.
actual studio stuff. So yeah,
Sorry,
it's not me.
bad.
It's not me. Like kind of
I was gonna say, I was like, wow, he's okay. I'll have to check these movies out. But yeah, okay.
So yeah, looking forward to kind of talking about the next in our series of the Godzilla movies and stuff. So once again, I'm John Chang with Dan Edmonds, and we will see you at the movies.